The Sleeping Rose by Angela Elwell Hunt, illustrated by Chuck Gillies. Once, within a faraway valley, Baldric Macklin, his wife, and 2 children lived on the outskirts of a bustling and prosperous kingdom. Baldric raised beans, wheat, and barley during the warm months, while his wife sewed lovely clothes for the village people. But in the springtime, Baldric devoted his time to the care of a single rose bush, a strong plant that every year produced only 1 flower. Baldric's son Jacob called it the May Day Rose, for though the blossom appeared in the early spring, the flower always opened to its purest color and sweetest fragrance on the first day of May. Baldric's daughter, Gretchen, said she had never seen a more perfect rose. "'Tis as white as sunshine on snow, and as soft as swan's down. Only a master gardener could grow such a rose," she said, and all the villagers agreed. "I'm not a master gardener," Baldric modestly replied. "I'm just a farmer," but at night he dreamed of wearing silks and satins and tending the king's royal gardens. Word of Baldric's May Day Rose spread throughout the kingdom, and one April a sealed parchment arrived at the Macklin farm. "Your Royal Highnesses, the King and Queen," the letter began, "request your presence at their May Day celebration. Bring your famous rose so the entire kingdom can rejoice in its beauty." Mrs. Macklin's mouth dropped open. "I must make us new clothes for the celebration. We must look our best, for surely you will become a royal gardener after this." Baldric's heart began to beat faster. "I must see to the rose," he said. He turned toward the gate where the plant was growing in a sunny spot, but gasped when he saw a beggar standing there. The man's feet were tied up in rags, and his dirty hands were gently stroking the rose bush. "Stop!" Baldric cried, running. "Get away! Have you no consideration? Have you no feelings?" "I only wanted," the stranger began. "I don't care. That rose bush is precious, with a right royal rosebud. Now get away! Scat! Shoo!" And the beggar hung his head and turned. But before he left, Baldric saw a single tear slide from the man's cheek and stain the rosebud. "Go!" Baldric cried. The next morning, Baldric yawned and smiled, imagining all the wonderful things the king would say about his talent with flowers. Then he went outside to look at his May Day rose. In a moment, Baldric was back in the house. "I'm a little worried," he told his family. "'Tis only 2 days until May 1st, and the rosebud hasn't begun to open." "Don't worry, Papa," Gretchen said. "Perhaps the rosebud is a wee bit thirsty. Why don't you give it a drink?" So Baldric did. That night he dreamed that the king dubbed him Sir Baldric, Knight of the Royal Gardens. He got up in the sun and went out to look at his May Day rose. In an instant he was back in the house. "I am worried," he told his family. "The king's celebration is tomorrow night, and the rosebud still hasn't begun to open." "Don't worry, dear," his wife said as she sewed a sleeve on his handsome new shirt. "Perhaps the rosebud is a wee bit chilly. Why don't you warm it with your cloak?" So Baldric did. The next morning, while it was still dark, Baldric climbed out of bed and went outside to look at his May Day rose. In a flash, he was back in the house. "Heaven help us!" he shouted. "Today is the king's festival, and the rose bush hasn't opened at all." Jacob opened his sleepy eyes and yawned. "Perhaps the rose bush is a wee bit lonely, Papa. Why don't you bring it inside?" "How can a plant be lonely?" Baldric smiled. "A bush has no more feelings than a rock, a tree, a beggar passing by." He caught his breath. The beggar had cried. Plants did not cry, nor did rocks or trees. But the beggar was a man in need, and Baldric had sent him away. Baldric's heart squeezed in sorrow. Surely a lonely man was more important than a single rose bush. "I'll be home later," he told his wife. "Keep a pot of stew on the fire." Baldric left his cozy house and searched throughout the countryside. He hiked across the land as flat as stretched cloth, then climbed over wrinkled hills where the ground gathered itself into deep folds thickly laced with vines. Finally, in a meadow near the road, he found the beggar sleeping in the grass. "Come, friend." Baldric slipped his cloak around the man's thin shoulders. "My wife has dinner waiting for us." "My goodness, how hungry you both must be," Mrs. Macklin said when they arrived. She motioned toward the table. "Come, both of you, warm yourselves by the fire as you eat." And after dinner, Mrs. Macklin gave both men new shirts and breeches and soft cloaks. And as the Macklins left the house to journey to the king's palace, Baldric glanced at the rosebush. The rosebush bud still had not opened. "It doesn't matter," Mrs. Macklin whispered. "You have done good things today." The royal celebration was everything the Macklins had dreamed it would be. Music and laughter filled the air as the king and queen led the dance of the maypole. After a grand feast, the king stood and the crowd fell silent. Baldric felt his heart sink as the king looked his way. "Baldric Macklin," the king's voice boomed over the crowd, "we have heard many wonderful reports about your May Day rose. Now we would like to see this wondrous flower for ourselves." Baldric stepped forward on trembling legs. "I am sorry, your majesty," he said, bowing, "but the rose has not yet bloomed." Baldric lowered his head in silence. That was the holding of 1,000 breaths. "I thought you were a master gardener," the king's voice rumbled. "I am sorely disappointed." "Do not be disappointed in Baldric Macklin, your highness." A different voice rang over the gathering, and Baldric lifted his head. "Baldric sees what others cannot," the beggar said, coming forward with the emerald green bud in his hand. "When others turned me away, Baldric searched and found me. He fed me from his table and exchanged my rags for warm clothes. Only he cared enough to see my broken heart." As the stranger spoke, tears of joy fell from his eyes onto the sleeping rose bush. Before the astonished gaze of the villagers, the rosebud frilled in the lamplight, spreading its snowy petals in a dazzling burst of brightness. The sweet fragrance of 1,000 roses filled the air. The brilliant blossom burned in gold-white radiance. The king and queen gasped in amazement. The stranger turned and placed his hands on Baldric's shoulders. "You have chosen the right thing," the stranger said, a smile lighting his eyes. "People matter more than praise. Know this, Baldric Macklin. Any time you offer help to a needy soul, you have offered it to me." With a gentle and great dignity, the man turned and walked away. As the crowd buzzed with the sound of people exclaiming over the beauty of the radiant rose, Baldric marveled over the stranger's parting words and the tender touch of the man's nail-scarred hands. Do you remember Jesus said, if you feeding the poor and helping the stranger is like helping him. And that's what Baldric did, didn't he? Who do you think the stranger was? I think in this story it was Jesus, don't you?